Do you believe in setting boundaries, even if it means losing people?
Do you know that feeling when you open your phone to kill a minute and instead it takes a bite out of you? Because there on your sister's feed is the big family photo shoot, everyone lined up like a Christmas card you never asked to be in, grandparents in the middle, my brother with his wife, even the golden retriever, and I am not there because no one told me, no one thought to loop me in, no one even tossed a lazy text with the details, and in that single moment the years of being the extra chair at Thanksgiving and the spare bed at Christmas and the optional +1 at graduations all collapse into something simple and crude, which is that I am the one they leave out when they want things neat and shiny. I didn't comment and I didn't call and I didn't do the whole "wow, looks great" lie, because there is a special kind of humiliation that happens when you have to pretend you were not forgotten on purpose. So I put the phone face down on the counter and just stood there trying to decide whether I was going to be the reasonable daughter who lets it slide again or the unreasonable one who finally says what has been sitting in my mouth for years, which is that I am not the problem child, I am the inconvenient reminder that their favorite stories about our family only work if I shut up and stand out of frame. It wasn't even the first time, and I know you get that, because every family has its habits. And ours is that my sister's wins are banners and my brother's mistakes are adventures and my work is a phase they humor by asking if I am still doing that little startup thing, which, by the way, signed a contract last quarter that would make my father's eyes roll back if he ever bothered to ask how the negotiation went, but he didn't, and when I mentioned it over dinner a few weeks ago my mother changed the subject to my sister's baby shower theme like she had a script to get through before dessert, and I remember thinking I am not mad, I am just tired, except then the photo shoot hit me in the gut, and I realized no, I am mad. I could have called and asked why no one said anything, and the answer would have been the same one it always is, some airy mix of miscommunication and last-minute plans, and we didn't think you'd want to drive that far. Which is code for we wanted it tidy and you ask questions, and I am not going to play dumb to make them comfortable, so I let the phone sit there, and I let the anger do laps until it got lean and sharp, because anger is not useless if you give it a job. There is something they never quite understood about me, which is that I do not throw plates and I do not post rants and I do not beg for invitations after the event. I build things, I make moves. I take whatever door was supposed to be locked to me, and I find the hinge, and the more I thought about that perfect family portrait with the little caption about tradition and gratitude, the more I started seeing the one pressure point they care about more than any apology, and that is face, the version of us they show the world, the neat narrative where my mother gets to be the organizer, and my father the anchor, and the kids the proof that they did it right. Here is the part that changed the game in my head, and maybe it sounds petty to someone who has never been strategically ignored, but it felt like clarity to me. If I wanted them to hear me for the first time in years, I had to speak in a language they actually respect, and in my family that language is not tears or confrontations, it is public status. The kind that shows up where people they care about will see it and draw their own conclusions without me saying a word. So I did what I do when I am building a product launch. I sat down with a notepad and I started listing assets. Not the financial kind, but the leverage kind. And the list was short because I don't have their attention on tap. But I do have a company with a clean brand and a recent win and a marketing budget that I control. And I have one other thing they forgot, which is a map of my mother's work neighborhood burned into my brain from years of picking her up after appointments and dropping off forms she forgot on the kitchen table, and right across from her office there is a bus stop with an ad panel that gets a ridiculous amount of foot traffic around lunch, especially when the nearby cafe is slammed, which I know because I have stood there with her while she pretended not to recognize my colleagues. I googled the outdoor inventory vendor like I was looking up a recipe, just casual, no racing pulse, and I found the placement number for that exact panel and I called the number on the site and I asked about availability, and the guy on the phone, who sounded like he has said the same sentences for 20 years, told me they had 1 week open starting Friday, and I said that would work and could we lock it in today if I sent artwork by tomorrow, and he said yes if I placed a deposit, and I said send the invoice and the specs and I will get you something clean that prints well, and my hands did not shake because this was not a tantrum, this was a plan. While the invoice hit my inbox, I kept hearing the imaginary argument I would have had with my parents if I had chosen that route. the one where I explain that excluding your grown daughter from a family portrait is not an accident. And they tell me I am overreacting, and I wanted to laugh, because the only reason I used to think I had to be reasonable is because I was still hoping they would meet me halfway, and I am done bartering with people who insist the table is full when they are still setting out extra forks for other people's guests. I drafted the line in my head before I opened any design software, because the message had to be simple enough to hit in one glance and specific enough to be undeniable. And I landed on a sentence that feels like a hand on the shoulder and a slap at the same time, which is exactly the mix they taught me by accident. And when the invoice link opened, I paid the deposit without blinking. And the subject line in my inbox changed to confirmation for one bus shelter panel across from my mother's office. And I know you want to ask if I hesitated, if I thought about the fallout or whether this was too much, and I did, for about 30 seconds. And then I remembered that every time I chose smaller, they got braver about shrinking me. So I hit send on the deposit and I typed the line for the ad into a blank document just to see it on the screen. And it looked right, and it sounded like me, and it was not cruel. It was accurate, it was earned. And it was going to live exactly where my mother could not walk around it. So here is your hook, the part where I stop being the invisible one and start being the story they have to explain to their own friends. Because by the time they finish passing around that perfect family photo in the group chat, I will have bought the view outside my mother's office, and by Friday morning, she will step off the curb, glance up like she always does, and read a sentence she will never be able to unsee. The day after I booked the ad felt like those hours after a dentist appointment when the numbness has not worn off yet, and you keep bumping your tongue against it because you are half fascinated and half scared of what happens when you feel everything again. So I did what has always kept me from making bad calls in the heat of the moment, and I went quiet on purpose. Not ghosting exactly, just stepping out of the family frequency where the smallest thing becomes a referendum on loyalty, and I muted the group chat with its steady drip of photos and plans and jokes that land only if you have not been the punchline before, and I let the phone buzz on the table while I answered emails from people who say my name with respect, which is a feeling I still forget is allowed when I cross my parents' threshold. I kept replaying the last few years as if I were scrubbing back and forth on a timeline in an editor, stopping at all the little cuts that did not bleed much in the moment but healed crooked. Like when I called my mother after we closed a deal that could change a company's runway, and she said she was happy for me in the same voice she uses to talk about a new detergent. Or when my father introduced my brother at a family barbecue as the one who always shows up for people, with that heavy pause after the word always that you only notice if it is aimed at you. Or when my sister told me, with that sugar over steel tone she loves, that I am intimidating to men because I talk about work too much and maybe I should laugh more. And I smiled and changed the subject because I knew where that road went and I was tired of driving it. What surprised me about the quiet week was how calm my mind got once the decision existed outside my head, because I am not actually someone who craves drama and I do not like the mess that comes with open fights, yet I do like follow-through and I like results. And buying that bus stop panel felt like sending an email to a version of my family that understands calendars and contracts more than they understand feelings, and the minute the confirmation landed in my inbox, I felt a little of that office air in my lungs, the kind you get when you put a plan on the board and everyone knows their role, and my role was to deliver clean artwork by the deadline and say nothing to anyone who could derail it with guilt. I kept drafting texts I would not send. Little one-liners to the group like "looks like you got everyone together this weekend," or the more honest version, which would have been "tell me you wanted a Christmas card without making me watch you crop me out in real time." And I deleted all of them because anger is part of this. But it is not the point, and the point is that they need to feel the absence they created, and they will only feel it if it shows up where they cannot cure it around it. Which is precisely why I left their chat on mute and poured that impulse into work where something useful could come out the other side. At the office, I told no one the personal version. I just told my head of marketing that I wanted to test a small placement in a downtown corridor as a brand lift experiment tied to founder visibility. Which is the most accurate lie I have ever said out loud, and he nodded and asked if we should test variations, and I said not this round. I want a single line, founder forward, simple logo lockup, no clutter. And he shrugged and asked for the copy by end of day, so the designer could set it before the vendor deadline, and I said I would send it myself because I needed to control tone, which he accepted because he knows I have a thing about words when the stakes are real. When you are dealing with people who pretend not to hear you, you learn to write for the glance, not the paragraph, so I opened a blank document and wrote the most direct sentence I could think of that would land both as a salute and a challenge. Then I stared at it and tried to imagine my mother reading it the way she reads menus and schedules and calendars, not the way she reads me, and I knew I had it the moment my stomach did that drop that only happens when the truth is sitting therein. Plain English and refuses to be softened, and I saved it with a file name I would not be embarrassed to see on a shared server, because this was not a prank, it was an announcement. Meanwhile, the family kept doing what it does, which is behave as if nothing is wrong until the weather changes, and then act shocked that it is raining, and my sister pinged me with a blurry photo from the shoot and a line about how cute the dog was, which is her way of checking if I am going to take the bait and make a scene, and I typed back that the dog is adorable and left it there, because you cannot argue with someone who is allergic to accountability and you cannot fix a dynamic by narrating it to people who benefit from not seeing it, and also because I had a calendar reminder for an artwork deadline, and I am the kind of person who meets those. I thought about calling my father, not to fight but to do that rational daughter thing where I explain that this hurts and could we handle it better next time, and I even rehearsed it once while making coffee, and the speech came out tidy and reasonable and boring. And I realized I've delivered that speech my entire adult life, and it has done nothing but teach them that I will swallow whatever they serve as long as they call it a misunderstanding, so I put the mug in the sink and shut up and went back to my laptop where the only misunderstandings are measured in pixels and deadlines. On Thursday afternoon, the vendor emailed to remind me that final files had to be submitted by 5 and that proofs would go up that evening for approval, and I checked the time and felt that little hum I get before a product push. The one that says in a few hours this will stop being an idea and start being a thing in the world that cannot be easily recalled, and I took one last pass over the line to make sure it did not wobble into cruelty or fall into apology. Because I refuse to be either the villain they accuse me of being when I set boundaries or the child they pat on the head when I behave, and once I was satisfied, I exported the artwork as the vendor requested, clean, high contrast, my name where it needed to be. My role stated without decoration, and the logo sitting there like a period. Right before I hit send, I had a flash of my mother asking me a few months back if the company is stable or if I have a plan to find a real job if it does not work out, and I remember answering in that polite tone you use with a bank teller. While inside, I was counting all the ways she would never ask my brother that question even though he has reinvented his career 4 times, and that memory did not make me cruel, it just made me precise, so I attached the file, wrote a short note to the vendor, copied the invoice number, and pressed send with the same feeling I get when I sign something that will move numbers for us, steady and done. If you are wondering whether I let the copy line slip to anyone in my life who would cheer me on, I did not, because there was a part of me that needed to hear it for the first time at the same moment my mother would, which means I had to hold it close until the moment it turned public, and maybe that is dramatic, but it is also honest, because some sentences only do their job when they arrive unannounced, and this one was built to arrive that way. And because this is the part where you want to know what exactly I wrote and whether I went for soft or sharp, I will tell you that I chose a line that doesn't scream or beg or throw shade in the cheap way. It just sits there like a fact my parents never wanted to say out loud, and the line I sent to the printer, the one that would be staring at my mother by lunchtime on Friday, said very simply, "Smile, you raised a chief executive officer." Once the file was out and the confirmation came back with that bland little line about production in progress, I did the thing I always do before a launch, which is walk through the path of the person who is supposed to see it. Not with a marketer's buzzwords, but like a regular human who is just getting through her day, because I did not want this to feel like a stunt that fades by dinner. I wanted it to land and sit and hum in the background like a smoke alarm you cannot quite ignore. So I mapped my mother's morning the way I remember it from years of pickups and drop-offs, the way she gets out of her car, crosses that patch by the bus shelter, checks her messages before stepping into the lobby, and I kept thinking, good. That is the moment. She will be half on autopilot and half awake to the world, and if the sentence is clean enough, it will jump the little fence in her mind she built for anything that sounds like me. The vendor sent a low residential proof that evening, and it looked exactly like it did on my screen, which is the only time in my line of work you get to feel a taste of certainty. So I approved it with a quick note and asked about install timing. And the rep said dawn on Friday, which made sense, and I said please confirm when the crew marks it live, because I have a timed social asset going out around lunchtime, and I need to know we are aligned, which is a polite way of saying I plan to pull two levers, one physical and one digital, and they need to move in sequence, or the impact gets messy. I am telling you this because it matters for how I think, and because the part of me that wanted to scream at my family also wanted to be bigger than that. So instead of a rant, I built a little ecosystem around a single sentence, nothing aggressive. Just a LinkedIn post cued with a short note about gratitude to mentors and a quiet nod to where I came from, plus a lightweight press blurb on our site about the contract we closed last quarter that my parents refused to hear about, and a tiny ad. Spend geofence to a few city blocks, not to brag to strangers, but to make sure a certain concentration of coworkers and neighbors would have the chance to scroll past my name on the same day they walked past it on a glass panel. Because the message works best when it echoes. I kept my circle tight, which means I told no one, not even my closest friend who would have brought confetti and a thermos at sunrise to watch with me, because I am old enough to know that secrecy is not always about drama. Sometimes it is about protecting the feeling of a clean hit from getting diluted by commentary and second-guessing, and also because I did not want anyone trying to make me soften it with an extra line or a smiley exclamation, since the whole point was that this sentence did not need a cushion. There was a moment late that night when I almost drafted a private email to my mother with a heads up, not to ask permission, but to buy myself the safety of having done the polite thing. And I closed the window because that is the exact reflex that has kept me stuck in a loop with them for years, this urge to make myself small in advance so they do not accuse me of being too much after the fact. And I decided that if I was finally going to act like the adult they refused to see, then I would let the consequences sit where they belong, which is with the choices they made about who counts when the camera is out. On Thursday, I handled my actual job with a level of discipline that would make a therapist suspicious, because focusing on other people's deadlines is the only way I know to stay out of the weeds when my personal life tries to drag me into the swamp. And between calls, I checked the campaign queue, tweaked a line break on the press note, set the LinkedIn post to go live at noon with comments open, and added a rule in my inbox that would flag any email from my father, because when he reacts, he does not text, he writes paragraphs that sound like lectures, and I needed to see that coming before it ran me over. I also did something that felt small but gave me spine, which was reach out to a photographer we work with and book him for a half-hour window around lunch on Friday to quietly shoot passersby near the bus shelter from the public sidewalk. Nothing invasive. Just candid proof of engagement for our own brand files, which is exactly the kind of sentence that would make my parents claim I am showy and manipulative, except that this is standard practice in advertising, and also I wanted, for once, to have my own receipts, not to throw in anyone's face, but to remind myself later that this happened, and I did not imagine the way people stopped and read and smiled. The night before the install, I lay in bed and rehearsed a dozen versions of the possible fallout, ranging from my mother pretending not to see it while her coworkers text each other under the table, to my sister calling me with that mix of concern and superiority she loves to spoon over everything I do, to my father asking me to take it down because it makes the family look divided, and I made a decision that made me feel both calm and brutal, which was that I would not explain the choice to anyone on Friday. Not even to the people on my side. I would let the sentence work, and I would leave the silence around it intact, because sometimes the refusal to fill the air is the most honest sound you can make. I woke before my alarm, checked my email for the vendor's live notice, saw nothing yet, made coffee, opened my laptop, and forced myself into a spreadsheet until the message came through with a timestamp just after sunrise and a little photo from the crew. And I stared at that not very flattering shot like it was a birth announcement. Then I closed it, put my computer in my bag, and went to work as if it were any other Friday, except it was not any other Friday, because I had placed something immovable in the path of a story that had always moved around me. Before I left the apartment, I unlocked my phone and looked at the scheduled LinkedIn post one more time, confirmed the timing, skimmed the press note, checked the tiny ad's geofence, and turned my attention back to the one thing that mattered most, which was that for the next several hours I would do nothing, say nothing, and answer no one, because the message was up, the echo was set, and the next move, whether they realize it or not, belonged to them. By mid-morning, the office felt like any other end-of-week shuffle where people are trying to look productive while their brains drift toward errands and small plans. And I kept my head down and my voice even because the one thing I promised myself was not to narrate the play while the ball was still in the air, so I answered a couple of vendor pings, signed off on a routine purchase order, nodded through a quick stand-up, and then, right around the time the first wave of lunches usually hits that block by my mother's office, my phone lit up with a photo from my cousin who works 3 buildings away. No caption at first, just the frame, the glass panel, the clean white background. The single line sitting there like a dare and my name under it like a signature. I finally stopped hiding, and before my brain could form a response, another text followed that said, in her unfiltered way, I am screaming, your mother is going to walk right into this. I felt that slow, steady surge you get when a plan stops being imaginary and starts breathing, so I locked my screen and put the phone face down because I did not want to be the person grinning at a device while pretending to listen to a colleague. And I made myself finish the email I was writing, hit send, took a breath, and let myself look again, which is when the next message came in from a friend who works in a bank on that block. She wrote that she had just watched 2 coworkers stop at the shelter and read the line out loud to each other with that tone people use when they see something they know is pointed, but do not yet know at whom. And then she added that someone who looked exactly like my mother stood there not moving for a long half-minute, phone in hand, face tight, and then walked into her building without speaking to the person beside her, which was either a coworker or one of those friends she keeps at a distance to save face. I did not reply and I did not call because I had already decided that I would not be the one to open any door that could be used to tell me I had made a scene. Instead, I let the day do its work while the photographer I had booked sent a quiet stream of images to a shared folder, anonymous bodies pausing as they passed, a hand pointing, a head tilted. And even though I had hired him for dull documentation the way you would for any small campaign, I knew I would return to those shots later when my parents tried to tell me that I had imagined the impact, because there is a kind of gaslighting families are fluent in, and I was done playing the understudy in that show. Around noon, my scheduled post went live, and within minutes, a handful of colleagues and old mentors dropped comments that were the opposite of the tone I grew up around, measured, proud, specific about the work and not the politics. And I watched the little notifications stack up not because the internet matters more than blood, but because I needed the parallel narrative to exist in the same moment, a quiet counterweight to whatever would unfold in the group chat that I still had on mute. And right when I was thinking that I might actually get through the day without direct fire, my sister finally texted with a message that had exactly the flavor I expected, a sugar crust over a jab, asking whether I had really plastered my job title across from our mother's office like a billboard for myself and whether I had considered how that might look. And I stared at the screen for a long breath and then wrote back that it looked exactly like what it was. A public thank you to the person who raised me, and left it there because if you wrestle a pig you both end up dirty, and this time I was not interested in mud. There was a long pause after that, and then a follow-up where she said she hoped I was not trying to make our parents feel bad because that would be unfair given how busy everyone has been, and I actually laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because the script is so predictable, and I typed and erased 3 drafts of a reply before choosing the one that cost me nothing, which was to say that I had a meeting and would talk later, which of course I would not. Because the only conversation worth having now needed to start with them, not me, and it needed to start with honesty, not with the kind of polishing they have always done to make their choices sound like weather. By early afternoon the cousin called, and I let it ring out because she is a gossip fountain with a sympathetic face, and I did not want to feed that machine, but her voicemail came through a minute later in a rush, saying that people in my mother's office were buzzing. That one of the partners had made a joke about getting my autograph, that my mother had been quiet all morning and had closed her door more than once, and that a few people who know me from childhood had sent her the bus stop photo with big reactions, which told me exactly what I needed to know, namely that the line had landed where I aimed it, not with cruelty, but with an unavoidable kind of clarity. At some point, my head of marketing pinged me to say the lunch hour engagement near the shelter was bonkers for a static panel and asked if we wanted to duplicate the asset in another corridor, and I told him we would take the win and hold the rest, which he took as founder caution, though it was really me protecting the boundary between the professional tactic and the personal message, because I was not going to turn my family into a campaign even if they have always turned me into a subplot in theirs. I kept working, I kept breathing, I kept my face neutral, and when the clock finally began to fold toward late afternoon, my phone lit again with a name that lands like a small weight in my chest, because my father does not call lightly. He calls to deliver verdicts and to ask for decorum and to remind me of everything he thinks I owe, and I watched it ring once, twice, 3 times, and I picked up not because I was ready to soothe him, but because I was ready to stop letting their silence set the terms of my life, and I said hello with a tone that held steady even as my stomach tightened, and he said my name the way he says it when he wants to make me feel 12 and reckless, and he asked me, in that clipped, measured way of his, why I had chosen to embarrass the family in public, and I told him I would answer him once, clearly and without apology, and then I would be done for the day, and before he could interrupt I took a breath and began. I told him, in a voice I have practiced in boardrooms and in rooms where people prefer me small, that if we were going to use words like embarrassment, then we needed to put them where they belonged. Because what happened at that bus shelter was not a tantrum, and it was not a smear, it was a sentence that matched a fact. And if the family felt a sting, then maybe it was because we had been pretending that leaving me out was a harmless oversight when it was really a policy, and I said I was done participating in the kind of politeness that turns grown women into ghosts so other people can keep their favorite stories polished, and that I would not be taking anything down or apologizing for being proud of something I built without any of the celebration that gets handed out in this family, like party favors to the people who play along. He went quiet in that way he does when he is choosing the angle that will put me back in my lane. Then he started in with the lecture about family unity and optics and how certain people in his circle might read the ad as a dig, and I cut him off, not rudely, but firmly, because I have let that speech run on me since high school and I am not a stage for it anymore, and I told him the only circle I am worried about right now is the one my mother stood in at that bus stop while she looked at a line she earned, whether she wants it or not, and if that makes her rethink the way she writes me into or out of our life, then good. That is the point. And if it makes him uncomfortable that anyone might ask why his daughter chose public pride instead of private pleading, then maybe he should ask himself why private pleading has never worked. He said I was being dramatic and vindictive, 2 words that live on his workbench whenever I set a boundary, and I said I was being accurate and strategic because I am not asking them for a seat at any table. I am building my own and naming the chairs. And if they want to feel included, they can walk in like everyone else does, not because I owe them deference, but because I am done paying for admission with silence. And I told him, plainly, that this was his one chance today to say he heard me, and that he would stop calling harm a misunderstanding, and if he wanted to keep the lines open then he could choose that, but if he wanted to keep coaching me to be smaller then I had a company to run and I was out of time. He exhaled into the phone the way men exhale when they realize the toolkit is not going to fix this. Then he asked if there was anything he could say that would make me pause, and I said yes. He could say that I was right, that they should have told me about the photo shoot, and that it was not an oversight, it was a choice, and that they were not going to do it again, and if he could not say that, then he could choose quiet and let the sentence do its work, because I was not going to spend the rest of the day translating my feelings for people who speak fluent avoidance, and after a long beat where I could hear his pride arguing with his love, he said he would talk to my mother and call me later. And I told him that if later meant after he had decided what story made them look best, he could save it, because I was not accepting revision anymore. I hung up and felt that familiar cocktail of guilt and relief do its pass through my chest, the one that says you stood up and you might pay for it, and I went back to my desk and finished a pricing deck because nothing steadies a person like a spreadsheet. And while I was toggling cells, my phone lit with a text from my sister that tried to play both sides, the surface apology for the mix-up paired with a nudge that maybe I could pull the ad early and we could do dinner, and I looked at it. And understood, finally and fully, that the real addiction in my family is to the reset, the pretend fresh start that requires me to swallow whatever just happened and prove I am not difficult. So I wrote back that I loved her and I was not changing the schedule, and that we could talk after the weekend if she wanted to have an honest conversation without the usual dusting of sugar, and I left it at that. By late afternoon, the photographer's folder had filled with enough proof to satisfy any doubter who might try to tell me I made a mountain out of a bus shelter, and my head of marketing messaged me a neat little graph showing unusual engagement around that block. And I said good work and shut my laptop, because the point of this was not data, it was power, and I needed to make the final move I had been holding in my back pocket for months, without quite knowing why, a move that would make it impossible to sink this whole thing under the word petty, because it would wrap the blade in something my parents understand and the city respects. I called our general counsel to confirm the language one more time, then I opened the announcement draft that had been sitting in my documents labeled with a date I had not been ready to pick, and I set it to publish on Monday morning. And what it said was simple and unarguable, that our company was funding a yearly internship and micro-grant program for first-generation founders and overlooked operators, named in honor of my mother's maiden name because she came from nothing and taught me, whether she meant to or not, how to stand up in rooms where no one expects you, and that the first cohort would be selected by a panel of people who remember what it feels like to be the extra chair. And yes, I knew exactly what I was doing, because attaching her name to a path my family never made easy for me was both generous and unflinching, and it meant that anyone who heard about the bus shelter would also hear about the fund, and if my parents wanted to be small about it, they would have to do it in front of something that looks like grace. Before I closed up, I opened the family group chat that had been hissing softly on mute all day, and I wrote one message, not a speech, not a dagger. Just a clean invitation that said I am hosting a small open house at the office next week for the team and a few mentors to mark the grant. You are welcome to come or not. There will not be speeches. No one owes anyone a performance. I will not chase you for a yes or no, and I will not be hurt if you choose to skip it. I just wanted to tell you directly, and then I turned the chat back to silent and put my phone in my bag, because the last piece of this was not to beg for their attendance. It was to make sure they understood that the door is there and that I am not standing under it anymore waiting. Over the weekend my mother never called, but late Sunday night I saw, because I went looking, that she had liked every single one of my company's posts for the last few months, and had even shared the press note about the contract with a line about being proud. No tags, no emojis, just that word, and it landed on me like a small stone in a jar that had been empty too long, and my father did not call back either, but he sent a message that said he would see me on Thursday and that he would behave if I did, which almost made me laugh, and my sister tried to broker a truce that sounded like a brunch, and I told her she could show up on Thursday if she wanted to, and that I had no truce to sign because I was not at war anymore. When Thursday came, they did come, not in a parade and not with apologies, but they stood in my space and shook hands with my team and looked at the wall where we keep the names of the people who made the work possible. And my mother touched the printout of the grant announcement with a look I have not seen on her in years, not awe, not regret, something closer to recalculation, and I did not milk it and I did not perform it, I just let it be. And when they left, my father said we should take a family picture sometime soon, and I said that is up to you, and I walked them to the elevator and went back to my conference room where my people were waiting, because the point here was never to win a photo, it was to end the part of my life where I asked to be seen. That night I renewed the bus shelter for one more week without telling anyone, not to twist the knife, but to give myself the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the sentence would stand there a little longer. And when I lay down, I did not think about whether it was too far or just far enough. I thought about how, for the first time in a long time, I had moved the center of gravity back where it belonged. And if there are questions still hanging in the air about holidays and traditions and what people will whisper at church, they can stay there, because the truth is simple and I finally said it out loud where it counts, which is that if they will not make room for me in their picture, I will make one so large they have to decide whether to step in or be seen stepping out, and either way, I am done being cropped.